Welcome to the last chapter in this course, chapter 29. It's called Challenging the Post-War Order, and it begins with lesson 29.1, Reform and Protest in the 1960s. It's a very comprehensive lesson. It's one of the longer ones, and it begins with quite a bit of housekeeping with reference to all the various things in the course and exam description that are covered in this particular lesson. Then there's an introduction to the chapter, which is Challenging the Post-War Order, and an introduction to this particular lesson, Reform and Protest in the 1960s. So we'll get started, and I'll try to keep this to a minimum. So why did the post-war consensus of the 1950s that we talked about in the last chapter break down? We've got College Board Topic 9.1, Contextualizing Cold War and Contemporary Europe. Explain the context in which the Cold War developed, spread, and ended in Europe. During the 20th century, diverse intellectual and cultural movements questioned the existence of objective knowledge, the ability of reason to arrive at truth, and the role of religion in determining moral standards. The experience of war intensified a sense of anxiety that permeated many facets of thought and culture, giving way by the century's end to a plurality of intellectual frameworks. Demographic changes, economic growth, total war, disruptions of traditional social patterns, and competing definitions of freedom and justice altered the experiences of everyday life. New voices gained prominence in political, intellectual, and social discourse. Then we have College Board Topic 9.3, Explain the causes, events, and effects of the Cold War in the period following World War II. The Cold War played out on a global stage and involved propaganda campaigns, covert actions, limited hot wars in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and an arms race with the threat of nuclear war. College Board Topic 9.4, Superpowers emerge. Explain the economic and political consequences of the Cold War for Europe. Central and Eastern European nations within the Soviet bloc followed an economic model based on central planning, extensive social welfare, and specialized production among bloc members. This brought with it the restriction of individual rights and freedoms, suppression of dissent, and constraint of emigration for the various populations within the Soviet bloc. Eastern European nations were bound by their relationships with the Soviet Union, which oscillated between repression and limited reform until the collapse of communist governments in Eastern Europe and the fall of the Soviet Union. After 1956, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies failed to meet their economic goals within the Soviet Union. Combined with reactions to existing limitations on individual rights, this prompted revolts in Eastern Europe, which ended with a re-imposition of Soviet rule and repressive totalitarian regimes. And we've got College Board Topic 9.6, Contemporary Western Democracies. Explain state-based economic developments following World War II and the responses to these developments. Post-war economic growth supported an increase in welfare benefits. However, subsequent economic stagnation led to criticism and limitation of the welfare state. The expansion of cradle-to-grave social welfare programs in the aftermath of World War II, accompanied by high taxes, became a contentious domestic political issue as the budgets of European nations came under pressure in the late 20th century. And we've got College Board Topic 9.8, 20th Century Feminism. Explain how women's roles and status developed and changed throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The lives of women were defined by family and work responsibilities, economic changes, and feminism. New models of marriage, partnership, motherhood, divorce, and reproduction gave women more options in their personal lives. And we've got College Board Topic 9.9, Decolonization. Explain the various ways in which colonial groups around the world sought independence from colonizers in the 20th and 21st centuries. The process of decolonization occurred over the course of the century with varying degrees of cooperation, interference, or resistance from European imperialist states. Despite indigenous nationalist movements, independence from many African and Asian territories was delayed until the mid and even late 20th century by the imperial powers' reluctance to relinquish control, threats of interference from other nations, unstable economic and political systems, and Cold War strategic alignments. And we've got College Board Topic 912, Technology. Explain how innovation and advances in technology influence cultural and intellectual developments in the period 1914 to the present. Medical theories and technologies extended life but posed social and moral questions that eluded consensus and crossed religious, political, and philosophical perspectives. And College Board Topic 914, 20th and 21st Century Culture, Arts, and Demographic Trends. Explain how and why European culture changed from the period following World War II to the present. Organized religion continued to play a role in European social and cultural life despite the challenges of military and ideological conflict, modern secularism, and rapid social changes. Reform in the Catholic Church found expression in the Second Vatican Council, which redefined the Church's doctrine and practices and started to redefine its relations with other religious communities. All of that is in this lesson. The place, Europe, of course, time frame 1960 to about 1974. Key concepts of reform and protest in the 1960s. Ostpolitik, the New Left. Social Democrats. Last time we had Christian Democrats. Now we have Social Democrats. The Prague Spring, the Brezhnev Doctrine, and the Second Vatican Council. Key people of reform and protest in the 1960s. Willy Brandt, Ho Chi Minh, Alexander Dubček, Leonid Brezhnev, and Richard Nixon. First, let's begin with this intro to the entire chapter. Challenging the post-war order, 1960 to 1991. So Lesson 28.2 was more focused upon the 1950s. In the 1960s, the West was all about three main priorities: managed economic expansion, job creation, and state-sponsored welfare benefits. Their goal was twofold: to improve living conditions and to create social consensus. The East still practiced political repression, but they still gained modest economic growth, and there were even limited reforms. Both sides were achieving stability. Cold War tensions were easing, but there was an important emerging question that both sides had to answer. Was affluence a legitimate pathway to political and social harmony? Or would economic abundance prove to be too hollow and superficial to create such harmony? And what might happen if all this abundance was somehow threatened rather than assured? Beginning in the late 1960s, when all the economic growth began to slow down significantly, it started to look like the answer to that first question was no. Without the economics, without the affluence, without all the stuff, it seemed there was nothing in its place that could unite the various peoples of Europe politically, socially, or spiritually. Economies declined. Global competition increased. New leaders introduced more conservative policies to deal with these new realities. An atmosphere of crisis and conflict emerged. Protest movements began to grow. New political groups saw their opportunities to gain traction. Feminists, environmentalists, nationalists, right-wing populists. In the East, leaders also struggled with economic stagnation. There was frustration and questions. Should they continue to restrict social freedoms and political freedom? Should they continue with centralized economic planning? Or would it be better to ease these controls? Later, in the 1980s, this decision would be made for them. Popular dissent movements would emerge in the satellite states. In the Soviet Union, attempts to overhaul the communist system would spin out of control. And from 1989 to 1991, communism would come to an end. Now we have an introduction to this particular lesson, the intro to reform and protest. As the 1960s went on, somewhat similar things were happening in both the East and the West. In the West, politics were shifting to the left. A new generation, raised on affluence instead of poverty, was actually expressing dissatisfaction with the status quo. What was it about the system that they found so objectionable? In the East, Khrushchev's reforms had been grudging and limited, and this also created protest, as we saw in Lesson 28.3. In both systems, East and West, it seemed that inequality was pervasive. Cold War tensions thaw. As we saw in Lesson 28.2, the moderate and pragmatic Christian Democrats had been extremely successful in guiding Western Europe through 2 decades of recovery and growth. They had practiced Cold War politics, they had supported free market economics, and they had supported welfare provisions. But in a way, the Christian Democrats had succeeded themselves into political irrelevance. They had successfully facilitated a bigger economic pie. And now there were many people who felt they were not getting their fair share of that bigger pie. Where does the left get its core political, social, and economic inspiration? Where has it always gotten its inspiration? Ever since the days of the Enlightenment philosophers from Lesson 16.3, when it was suggested that people were of equal value and that nobody was essentially better than anyone else. As we come to the end of this course, and we take stock of what we've seen, I would suggest that it comes down to 2 things: equality versus inequality, and equity versus inequity. The pie was getting bigger, but those new pieces of pie were going to the social elites, hence the rise of the Social Democrats in many countries. So in 1963, the Socialist Party entered the Italian parliament. In 1964, the Socialist Labor Party actually took power in Great Britain. And in 1969, West Germany got a social democratic chancellor, Willy Brandt. Of course, Spain, Portugal, and Greece all had authoritarian governments into the mid-1970s. In the mid-1970s, all 3 of those countries would finally get rid of their authoritarian regimes. These new politically left players, the Social Democrats, had a more radical view toward the East Bloc. Instead of being adversaries, let's try to normalize relations with the East Bloc. Social Democratic West German Chancellor Willy Brandt actually went to Communist Poland in 1970 and publicly apologized on behalf of the German people for the crimes they had done to Poland during World War II. West Germany even signed a treaty of reconciliation with Communist Poland. Willy Brandt called this new approach Ostpolitik. He signed similar treaties with Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. He officially recognized East Germany as an independent country for the first time. Brandt called this new paradigm 2 German states within 1 German nation. Détente. Willy Brandt's efforts ushered in a feeling of relaxation of tensions throughout the West and the East, which has been called détente. Both sides agreed to limit nuclear weapons. East and West did a joint space mission in 1975. They agreed that existing frontiers could not be changed by military force. There were guarantees made of civil and political rights. The Helsinki Accords would be encouraging for East Bloc dissidents who felt that their civil rights could now be protected. Domestic goals. Social Democrats ramped up state spending on public services. Many of these welfare systems had already been established in the 1950s by the Christian Democrat-dominated governments. So the Social Democrats weren't restructuring what the Christian Democrats had built, they were expanding what the Christian Democrats had built. Ideologically, the Social Democrats steered away from what the East Bloc was doing. There was no command economy. There was no nationalization of key industries. There were no one-party political systems. Instead, the Social Democrats supported these things: capitalist free markets, multi-party democracy, welfare provisions to fight social and economic inequality. The biggest weakness in free enterprise systems is that they drift steadily toward inequality. The main cause of that drift is greed. As overall wealth increases, Capitalists tend to help themselves to larger and larger portions of that increasing pie. As we've seen in previous lessons, they often feel perfectly entitled, justified, and very comfortable doing this. Their wealth often puts them in a completely insulated social environment. They have almost no regular interaction with their workers. They don't really know their workers. So the wealthy often live in a social echo chamber where they make and hear a lot of assumptions about themselves and about the working classes below them. This is not to turn anyone against capitalism. We live in a society where you have unprecedented freedom to pursue your own interests and your own passions any way you choose. No one can tell you, no, you can't do that. We live in an entrepreneurial golden age of endless and unimaginable possibilities. We live in the days of the $100 startup company. You can market yourself from a home computer. You can build a recording studio that would have cost thousands and thousands of dollars just a few years ago in your bedroom. You can write a novel and publish it electronically. There are 4 erroneous assumptions that we have seen the wealthy often make. First, this wealth is entirely because of me. It doesn't seem to matter whether their wealth is new or inherited. Sometimes they even look down upon new money. I provide all the leadership and all the talent. I take all the risks. So because they only associate with each other, they have this inflated view of themselves, their abilities, and their contributions. Second, they make corresponding assumptions about the workers below them. They're not even worth what I pay them now. They're lazy. They just want to work as little as possible. They have no ambition or drive. They just want to take advantage of me. They're inferior to me and less deserving than I am. This has been a big theme throughout this entire course. We've seen this attitude reflected in many of our lessons. We all love to feel superior to others. This is a great weakness in the human psyche. When we feel superior to others, we can treat them any way we want to and feel great about it. We can feel intellectually superior, we can feel morally superior, we can feel culturally superior, and we can even feel biologically superior. Third assumption they make: they want what I have because they are jealous of me. It's a variation of what James Franco said in the movie The Interview. They hate us because they ain't us. They know I'm better than they are. They know they have no desire to go out and earn what they want like I did, so they hate and resent me. They want me to apologize for accomplishing things that they didn't accomplish. There was a TV show called Undercover Boss. An owner or a CEO of a large corporation would disguise himself as a worker to find out what was really going on down in the trenches of the company. And what you saw consistently on that show was that these bosses really had no idea what their workers did. They had no idea how hard their workers worked or how difficult their jobs were, what they went through every day, or what they had to put up with. They were often astonished at how wrong their assumptions had been about their workers and about themselves and their own sense of superiority. Oftentimes, the bosses themselves could not meet the demands that even the lowest jobs placed upon them, jobs that their own employees endured every day. Sometimes they would get fired from these jobs because they could not do the most menial tasks at the companies that they themselves ran. And too often, these bosses saw these lowest workers get regularly browbeaten and humiliated by their own middle management. A fourth erroneous assumption is our status must be institutionalized or it will not last. The government must work for us and not for the undeserving. So we are going to use our wealth to incentivize the government to make policies and laws that favor us. Tax laws, trade policies, environmental laws, safety laws, union laws, wage laws, licensing laws, public disclosure laws, housing laws, education laws, voting laws, any government actions that impact our money, we need to be able to influence. All of this presents a danger that capitalism, because of its propensity to reward greed, because of the social isolation, and because of its desire to and ability to control public policy in its favor, can undermine and cannibalize itself through ever-increasing levels of inequality. One way to prevent this danger is to get rid of capitalism altogether and accept the corresponding consequences to individual rights and freedoms. And we've seen this proposed many times throughout this course. This goes all the way back to Lesson 21-2 on the spread of radical ideas, utopian socialism, anarchism, Marxism, the Russian Revolution, the Eastern Bloc. All of these movements said that there is so much greed, so much inequality, so much abuse, and so much corruption inherent in capitalism that we're simply not going to have free enterprise, and that will fix that. But what if you don't have to do anything nearly that drastic? What if you could keep the benefits of capitalism, like the economic growth, the reward incentives, and the entrepreneurial freedom, but also have oversight and controls in place to mitigate capitalism's dark side? Hence, welfare provisions. Our textbook on page 983 describes the social democrat approach to all the issues that we've described with capitalism in this sentence. At the same time, they viewed welfare provisions as a way to ameliorate the inevitable inequalities of a competitive market economy. And as we've just seen, that one sentence is packed with meaning. What kinds of welfare provisions are we talking about? Well, healthcare provisions, education, old age pensions, public housing, and how do you pay for it? High taxes. The center-right Christian Democrats generally supported the Social Democrats' increases in spending. Remember that the Social Democrats were not really creating new programs. They were simply expanding the programs that the Christian Democrats had created when they were in power. The Christian Democrats were willing to go along as long as the economy kept growing. So it looked like things were going great in Western Europe. The Social Democrats were in charge. The Christian Democrats were generally cooperating. There were heavy taxes, but ordinary people were getting a lot in return for those taxes. Capitalism, free enterprise, and free markets were flourishing. Economies were growing. What could possibly go wrong? A lot, as it turns out. Basically, anything that comes along and slows the economy down is going to undermine the entire setup. The affluent society. So we've seen this political shift to the left. Based upon what we've discussed, it's not surprising that economic growth and higher wages didn't impact everyone equally. The educated middle class expanded and prospered, but workers and immigrants didn't see nearly as much improvement in their lives. People in less developed, less industrialized areas also didn't feel as much impact of economic growth. Travel and tourism grew. Many people had more disposable income to spend. People had mandatory month-long vacations. More people could afford cars. There were also more family cars that were less expensive to buy and maintain. Consumer markets grew. Homemakers had more time to be consumers with washing machines, etc. Refrigerators actually made supermarkets possible because you could store more food that needed to remain cold. The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965. Up to this time, the Catholic Church in Europe was quite dogmatic and reactionary in terms of how it guided its people morally. Pope Pius XII, who reigned from 1939 to 1958, had made very uncompromising demands of Catholics. He had also involved the official Catholic Church heavily in politics. He had close ties to Mussolini. He looked the other way regarding the Nazis. He enthusiastically supported Catholic dictators in Spain and Portugal. Catholic clergy throughout Europe were under strict instructions to turn out the vote for the Catholic political parties and only them. It wasn't until 1967 that a Dutch bishop suggested that Catholics could vote for a non-Catholic party without risking excommunication. The Catholic Church also took a very antiquated hard line on such things as family life, moral behavior, and inappropriate books and films. And at the same time, demands for divorce were rising steadily. The post-war baby boom made the church's case against contraception obsolete, and church attendance was down everywhere. There were multiple reasons for all of this that people could point to. Small Catholic villagers had more social and geographical mobility. Women were more free to be involved in politics. Catholic charities and schools were declining due to the emergence of the competing welfare state that we've talked about. Many Catholic Church leaders understood that they were not going to turn the situation around by doing what they had always done in the past, appealing to tradition and authority, labeling more liberal ideas as communism. Finally, Pope Pius XII died, and Pope John XXIII took over the church. The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, Pope John XXIII called a new Vatican Council to attend to these new difficulties. He wanted this council to bring up to date the attitudes and practices of the church. And the Second Vatican Council, known as Vatican II, met for 3 years and made sweeping changes. They wanted to present to the world a Catholic Church that was no longer afraid of change. They wanted to present a Catholic Church that could respond to the challenges of modern life. And they wanted to offer the world a form of Christianity that was no longer opposed to such things as liberal democracy, mixed economies, modern science, rational thought, secular politics. The practical results of Vatican II. Church services could now be conducted in local languages instead of just Latin. Nobody knew Latin anyway. The first steps towards reconciling with other Christian denominations was taken. They acknowledged their responsibility to discourage anti-Semitism. This was also the first time that the Catholic Church declared that the Jews were actually not responsible for the death of Jesus. Vatican II declared that the Church would no longer support authoritarian regimes. Hence, throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the Catholic Church was just as likely to be on the side of the opponents of these regimes. Not everyone was happy with these changes. The future Pope, John Paul II, was a delegate to Vatican II. He would become Pope in 1978, and John Paul II saw it as his mission to restore the full weight of the Catholic Church's moral authority and influence. He believed in an uncompromising church hierarchy. In the end, the Second Vatican Council was not very successful in reversing the overall trend towards secularization. In Italy, church attendance among Italian Catholics fell from 69% in 1956 to 48% in 1968. However, these trends have been universal in all religions throughout Europe, and it was probably not realistic for the Catholic Church to think they could do much about it. Perhaps the most significant achievement of Vatican II was that it finally, truly got the Catholic Church out of electoral politics in Europe. Popes and bishops no longer threatened Catholics with serious consequences if they didn't vote the right way. Material affluence impacted more of society than just the church. The number of single adults grew. People married later in life. Families got smaller. Divorce rates went up. Population began to decline, sometimes to even less than zero. The Counterculture Movement. In Lesson 28.5, we studied the youth culture movement that emerged in the 1950s. Now we see a counterculture movement emerge in the 1960s. A new generation came up in conditions and with a level of awareness that was unprecedented. This generation grew up in an environment of political liberation. They grew up in a historic level of abundance, and they grew up while the horrors of World War II and fascism were still fresh. They grew up watching former colonies gain independence, and they grew up with the conformity that their consumer society demanded of them. They were educated enough to perceive the unequal distribution of wealth that we've discussed. And they had enough education to see the corresponding social injustices that went with economic inequality. But most importantly, unlike many previous generations, they also had the freedom to take action and protest against the things they saw. All of these social factors got a spark from the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. The history of the Civil Rights Movement is huge in and of itself. The sit-ins, the demonstrations, the boycotts, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the major figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis. The narrative we often get, even from our textbooks, about the Civil Rights Movement is that the federal government took the initiative and took the lead to correct the injustices that were out there and faithfully did its job and enacted all of this wonderful civil rights legislation. That's actually not true. The federal government initially had no intention of doing anything on its own. It had to be pushed into taking action by a dedicated and determined grassroots movement. It's easy to think of these student protests as just a school thing. But authorities recognize that college campuses are factories of political thoughts and ideologies that impact all of society. Let's not forget the Carlsbad Decrees of 1819, which we learned about in Lesson 21.1. Metternich's conservative order outlawed liberal student organizations in German universities to clamp down on nationalism. Universities and university newspapers were policed. Investigatory committees with spies were installed at campuses. The New Left. The New Left became the ideological force behind the counterculture movement. What did the New Left believe? The New Left didn't just criticize capitalism. It did criticize capitalism for sure. It criticized its toleration of economic inequality. It criticized capitalism's culture of conformity and consumerism. It criticized its propensity to create artificial needs through marketing to make money. Think of A Charlie Brown Christmas and all of the commentary it had about capitalism. An exasperated Charlie Brown goes off on all this consumerism. Sally, talking about how she just wants her fair share from Santa. Snoopy's excess abundance of bones. And this came out in 1965, in the middle of the counterculture movement. But one of the reasons that the New Left was so new was that it also criticized Soviet-style communism. It was totalitarianism. The New Left said that both systems deserved criticism for being dehumanizing. The New Left sought to bring humanity to politics. A popular phrase was, "The personal is political." People aren't just numbers and statistics. Political policies of every imaginable type impact people on a personal level. You almost can't think of a policy that doesn't. A big part of this from the 1960s was the sexual revolution. The birth control pill hit the market. We've talked off and on in lessons such as 18.1 and 22.3 about such things as sex, pregnancy, prostitution, and their impact on family and community. Now the birth control pill was changing the way people were thinking and behaving with regard to sexual issues. What traditional cultural norms and moral standards were still valid or necessary if you could totally control pregnancy? And this questioning of norms spread to all kinds of other sexual issues: homosexuality, marriage, living together. People experimented more with drugs. Drugs were a sign that you were countercultural. You were challenging the straight people, the squares, and the uptight people. In the 1960s, straight didn't mean heterosexual. Straight meant you were old and conventional and you wanted to impose your conventionality on everyone else. But in experimenting with drugs, you weren't just rebelling against your uptight parents. You were rebelling against the entire unjust and dehumanizing system that had produced your uptight parents. This was the system where you were expected to go to school, get a job working for the establishment, and live a dull, meaningless life. Psychologist and Harvard professor Timothy Leary became famous by encouraging young people to experiment with LSD with the slogan, "Turn on, tune in, drop out. These 6 words seem to say LSD will raise your consciousness and awareness and thus enable you to see the futility of blindly following society's expectations of you. The counterculture movement had its own music. England had the likes of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Moody Blues, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, the Small Faces, and many more. America had the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, the Doors, the Association, and many more. And all of these groups had songs about drugs. For example, the Beatles' Tomorrow Never Knows was inspired by Timothy Leary's own book, The Psychedelic Experience. Certain cities became centers of counterculture: London, Paris, West Berlin, San Francisco. The Vietnam War. This was one of the biggest sources of protest. The Vietnam War was a quagmire of a war for us for many years. No matter how many troops we sent, up to 550,000, or how many bombs we dropped, we couldn't win. The United States was invested in the Vietnam War much earlier than you would expect. The French had fought Ho Chi Minh's Communist Independence Coalition, the Viet Minh, throughout the first half of the 1950s, and the U.S. was supplying 80% of the money for that war to France. When the French finally proved that they were no match for Ho Chi Minh's forces, the United States cut them off. A 1954 Geneva Peace Conference temporarily created a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. The goal was that the country would be united by a nationwide election. But the U.S. and the Communist parties couldn't agree on who would supervise those elections. So the U.S. and South Vietnam refused to sign the accords. Both North and South Vietnamese governments were repressive. There was years of political chaos in the South, which the U.S. could not control. Even a U.S.-backed deadly coup couldn't solve the problem. And when LBJ became president, he was a big believer in the Domino Theory and believed that the U.S. had to battle communism with strength and determination. At first, the American public was in support of the war. All of our presidents believed in the Domino Theory. The Domino Theory said that if one Asian country falls to communism, its neighbors would also fall like dominoes. There was no logical or historical reality to this theory. It was fueled entirely by irrational fears of the power of communism. The Domino Theory made it seem like the U.S. could not afford to lose in Vietnam. So Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson gradually escalated our presence in Vietnam until we had 500,000 troops there. Americans saw the war as a Cold War issue rather than as an imperialism issue because Ho Chi Minh had both Chinese and Soviet support. Public support for the war did not last. Vietnam was the first, quote, television war. Americans could follow the war and see the fighting footage on the news nightly. Also, there was a draft which forced young American men to fight in the war. The military drafted a lot of working class and small town and rural kids. But they also got a lot of college kids who had stopped taking classes, often due to the counterculture movement. Guess where a lot of the new left intellectuals got their recruits? Protests and demonstrations against the war began as early as 1965. These protests spread through not only the United States, but through Europe as well. All of this protest came to a head in 1968, a pivotal year all over Western society. The Tet Offensive happened. The Tet Offensive. This was a massive coordinated ground attack on over 100 cities in South Vietnam in January 1968. It included military installations. It included the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. government had been telling the public that the U.S. was winning the war and that the end had come into view. The Tet Offensive killed 1,100 American soldiers in a month, and it all played out on TV for Americans to watch. On the battlefield, the Tet Offensive was a victory for the U.S. and its ally, South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese took heavy losses, and they failed to spark an uprising in the South, and they failed to convince South Vietnamese soldiers to abandon their army. But off the battlefield, it was a huge public relations win for North Vietnam. It showed the American public that the Vietnam War was not nearly over. It would later be revealed in the Pentagon Papers that the U.S. government had already known for years that the Vietnam War was not winnable. Protests and public pressure to end the war skyrocketed. In May of 1968, peace talks began in Paris between the U.S., South Vietnam, and North Vietnam. That same year, North Vietnam launched 2 more massive orchestrated offensives like the Tet Offensive just to show that they still had the capability to do so. And these negotiations in Paris lasted for years. In 1968, Richard Nixon campaigned for president on the platform that he would provide new leadership that would end the Vietnam War. Nixon became notorious for saying that he had a, quote, secret plan for bringing about a quick victory and that people would just have to trust him on that. His opponent even accused him of claiming to have a secret plan. To this day, if you want to score points against a political opponent who is being vague, you compare him to Nixon and his secret plans. However, Nixon never actually claimed to have a secret plan for ending the war. He even told the Los Angeles Times that he had, quote, no gimmicks or secret plans. Nixon even said, if I had any way to end the war, I would pass it on to President Johnson. Nixon lusted, that's his word, after power. He had absolutely no scruples and no regard for legality. The Watergate scandal was just the tip of the iceberg in his corrupt administration. But he never said he had a secret plan to end the war. That was a myth. As president, Richard Nixon followed a policy called Vietnamization. This involved gradually turning the responsibility for maintaining South Vietnam's sovereignty over to South Vietnam. Nixon also ended the draft. He reduced the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam from 550,000 to 24,000. Nixon reached a peace agreement with North Vietnam in 1973. And when North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam in 1974, the United States did not intervene. South Vietnam surrendered to North Vietnam, and Vietnam became a unified communist country. And guess what? The sky didn't fall after all. Today, we actually have a very good relationship with Vietnam, in spite of everything. Student revolts and the year 1968. Opposition to the Vietnam War throughout North America and Europe led to a wider range of opposition for the New Left. Colonial independence movements, the nuclear arms race, calls for world peace, the environment, social justice. 1968. In 1968, there was a watershed of protests and riots throughout the world. It may have been sparked by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th. It took place in diverse cities around the world: Chicago, Mexico City, Tokyo, Paris, West Berlin, East Berlin, London, Warsaw, Prague. The May events in France. In Paris, the May events took place. It started as a takeover of University of Paris buildings by a group of students. It resulted in a massive street battle between police and protesters. 367 people were wounded. 200 cars were burned. The riot triggered a national revolt across France. 10 million factory workers went on strike. Protesters occupied factory buildings all over the country. President Charles de Gaulle had to surround Paris with troops. The economy of France was brought to a standstill. The May events were resolved in a way that is reminiscent of the events of 1848. In Lesson 21.5, we saw how a coalition of radicals and liberals can work together to revolt and take power. But these coalitions, as we learned, lack unity, which is their Achilles heel. The different factions have different goals and agendas. They might come from different classes. They might be rural versus urban. One might be more ideological, the other might be more pragmatic. And these differences become more apparent when these uneasy alliances start making their demands. Conservative forces were much more unified. They're all of the same class, ideology, agenda, etc. And when they eventually rally and regain their footing, as they always manage to do, they take advantage of the competing agendas of their opponents. And we saw that happen in Germany, Austria, and France in 1848. And this is exactly what happened in Paris 120 years later. The student protesters of the New Left were protesting against things like war, conservative universities, the abuses of capitalism. The factory workers, however, were protesting against bread and butter issues, pay, benefits, work hours, working conditions. And when the French government promised reforms to the factory workers, including pay raises, the strikers broke ranks with the students and went back to work. In Lesson 21.5, we saw how the socialists under utopian socialist Louis Blanc overthrew King Louis Philippe in 1848. The socialists were certain that they were going to win big in elections to the newly formed Constitutional Assembly. They were sure they had the support of the French people, but for reasons they did not anticipate, they got demolished in those elections. Conservatives won those new seats overwhelmingly. 120 years later, Charles de Gaulle dissolved the French parliament and called for new elections. Again, the conservatives won 75% of the seats. For the second time in 120 years, the French people rejected radical change and opted for traditional conservative government. General strikes and student-led protests did not have the support of the French people. Universities throughout France closed that summer. Some educational reforms were made. Protests dissipated by the time the fall semester began. And throughout Europe, counterculture protest never again reached the peak it had attained in 1968. If protests and demonstrations were not as effective, there were two other ways to work for social change. One was to work within the system, join political groups and parties, run for elected office, enact legislation for change. The other way was violent terrorism, bombings, kidnappings, assassinations, robberies. Police and security forces proved to be pretty good at tracking these groups down and defeating them. This chart shows that the number of deadly terrorist attacks has actually gone down significantly since 1970. It's also interesting to note how many terror attacks are not inspired by Islam. The 9/11 attack is not shown because this chart only shows attacks in Western Europe. In addition, the number of deadly attacks has continued to decrease since 2016, the last year depicted on this chart. The map shows where all the terrorist attacks are. Notice that by far the biggest concentration of attacks in Western Europe is in Northern Ireland. The frequency of terrorist attacks has actually shifted over to Eastern Europe since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In the end, the counterculture movement made only limited political and social gains. Rebellions in terms of lifestyle and culture were more significant, but even these did not substantially alter our institutions. The 1960s and the East Bloc. The Berlin Wall was this 100-mile concrete barrier that showed that communism was there to stay. Ironically, it actually took the focus of the Cold War off of Berlin. For 3 years, Berlin had been the site of intense standoff between East and West. An unsustainable percentage of East Germans were leaving East Germany and entering West Germany through Berlin. And in West Germany, they were given automatic West German citizenship. The East Bloc was getting more and more impatient about the situation, and the West was getting more and more stubborn about not doing anything about it. Both sides had tanks and soldiers roaming around both sides of the city and crossing paths all over the place. So when the wall was built in 1961, it actually had a stabilizing effect on a highly volatile situation. Both sides saw the Berlin Wall as more of a solution than a problem. As the economies of the East Bloc countries lagged behind those of the West, East Bloc countries started looking for ways to make adjustments. The dilemma they faced was that they had an ideologically driven economy. In an ideologically driven state, it's hard to admit that there are major problems because admitting major problems suggests that the ideology is unsound. So, as long as your decisions are driven and constrained by that ideology, any reforms you attempt are going to have to be very limited. One of the problems they identified was the extreme central planning inherent in communist economies. Decentralization, letting local decision makers participate in local economic planning, sounds so uncoordinated and so unsupervised to the communist mind. You don't know what these local people will do. You could be inviting local people to regress right back into capitalist practices and undermine the whole revolution. And capitalism is evil. Any level of decentralized planning also inherently means you're going to allow some decisions to be made based upon market factors. And that's a scary scenario if you're a diehard communist. Now you're talking about dealing with such things as private enterprise and labor markets and profit motives and greed and exploitation. Hungary instituted its new economic mechanism. They broke up some state monopolies, they allowed some private stores, and they allowed private farming. East Germany had its new economic system. It was somewhat successful until it was reversed in the late 1960s. A second problem that the East Bloc countries recognized was their unhealthy emphasis on heavy industry. They needed to manufacture more things that consumers, regular people, could buy and use in their homes and in their daily lives. Some Eastern Bloc countries like East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia did pretty well at this. For example, television ownership went way up in these countries. Other East Bloc countries like Poland, Albania, and Romania did this poorly. In the end, none of these economies could manufacture enough consumer goods to meet demand. A third problem that the East Bloc countries recognized was that some limited cultural freedoms were going to have to be necessary if they were going to prosper. This was particularly true of film and literature. In the Soviet Union and other East Bloc countries, it became permissible for intellectuals to create works that criticized life in the East Bloc, as long as you didn't criticize communism itself. Dissidents who crossed the line could be punished in all sorts of ways. One way to get around government restrictions on culture was to publish works as samizdat, literally self-published. Samizdat referred to works that were printed in secret and then passed from reader to reader by hand. And they included books, newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets. The Prague Spring. Of course, one country in the East Bloc is going to take these reforms too far and get its wrist slapped by the Soviet Union. In the 1950s, it was Hungary under Imre Nagy in 1956, as we learned in Lesson 28.3. Between 2,500 and 3,000 Hungarians were killed in the Soviet invasion, and Nagy himself was hanged in 1958. In the 1960s, it was Czechoslovakia, and of course, it had to be in 1968, when counterculture was at its peak in the West. Czechoslovakia's new leader was Alexander Dubček. He was educated in Moscow, he was a diehard communist, but he also believed that communism could play nice with personal freedoms and multi-party democracy. Communism, as we have seen, says if you grant people too much personal freedom, they will give in to their greed and regress back toward capitalism. And you don't need a multi-party system because that opens the door for your party to lose power in democratic elections. Alexander Dubček called his program Socialism with a Human Face. He reduced state censorship, he decentralized decision-making, he included more diverse groups in the decision-making, trade unions, workers' councils, even consumers. Communist leaders in Poland and East Germany really didn't like what Dubček was doing. They weren't that popular as leaders in the first place, and their own people were noticing the reforms that the Czechs were enjoying, and they didn't want their own people's dissatisfaction to come back on them. The Soviet Union really didn't like what Dubček was doing either. They were concerned that Czechoslovakia would declare its neutrality or even join NATO, and the fact that Dubček constantly emphasized his loyalty to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact didn't alleviate their fears. Today, Czechoslovakia is now two independent countries, both of which are members of NATO. At first, East Bloc countries just used threats and intimidation to discourage Czech reformers. But when that didn't work, 500,000 Soviet and East Bloc troops invaded the country. And after what they saw happen in Hungary in 1956, Czech leaders knew not to resist. And so Czech leaders immediately surrendered to Soviet demands. Because of Czechoslovakia, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev issued the Brezhnev Doctrine. And this declared that the Soviet Union and its allies had the right to intervene militarily in any East Bloc country to defend communism. The invasion of Czechoslovakia showed the world that the Soviet Union would do what it had to do to preserve communism in the East Bloc.